discover what's out of the network if you're looking for certain indicators, like the types of devices of the manufacturer, and start with trying to move those devices and those network areas into a segregated network to again, protect them from the rest of the environment. And then look at chipping away at that over time, either through a big exercise or resegmenting of the network overall, or perhaps even just something that you work on over the course of a year or two to start to get to a better place. But what's not a good idea is to sit and living on a flat network with these relatively insecure machines. That becomes just a ticking time bomb of either those devices becoming compromised and either hurting someone or supporting a breach event at some point. So that the segmentation is one of the more important things. It's one of the harder things to do in terms of level of effort, but it's one of the most important and most effective mechanisms to getting a handle on this. Also, for any internet-facing systems, so even if some devices have internet capabilities or are hosted through, have web application portals and things that can be used for remote service, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. But if you do deploy any kind of internet-facing devices and platforms, make sure that you incorporate them into a demilitarized zone or DMZ model where there's some layer of protection between that device, between the internet, that device, and the rest of the internal network, so that if the device or those components that are internet-facing do become compromised, the bad guys and the malware can't necessarily jump so easily to other systems in the environment. So that's a standard network architecture model. There's nothing too fancy about that. It's been around for a while, but we haven't seen medical devices really deployed using a DMZ model and where appropriate. So that's the type of conversation you have when you're purchasing the product. It's the type of question you ask with your technical folks when you're looking to acquire the platforms of whether or not they have internet-facing pieces and how can we secure that. The other piece is remote multi-factor authentication for remote access. This is huge. So in those cases where we were able to, from testing we've done, we're able to use those default passwords, usernames and passwords that are used to support devices. If there was a second factor authentication, like a text message that needed to go to the end user to validate with a set of codes that it's actually them logging in, if that were in place, then this attack would never work and we wouldn't have been able to compromise as many networks as we have through our testing if there was that second factor authentication in place. And usually there's not a high volume of individuals that need to remote in to support these devices. It's not like you have your entire workforce accessing the medical device, but it's the vendor, maybe some IT folks. So deploying a second factor authentication for those individuals isn't a huge lift. It's not a huge expense. And with the technology out there now that's gotten a lot more capable, it's quick and easy to do these days. Can't speak enough about intrusion detection and networking. Make sure that you've got the capabilities to be able to monitor activity on your network. So making an assumption that, okay, these devices are really insecure, it's really hard to patch them, we're not going to get there right away. Do I have the capability to detect if one or more of my devices is compromised and if there's any malicious activity coming to or from those devices, and even running some custom rules and monitoring around those devices to see what's coming and going. Now this is where if you do have a network segment in place, you do have the medical devices all in one single network segment, it becomes a lot easier to monitor them and know what's coming to and from those areas. So you don't necessarily have to have that in place, but it helps a lot. Otherwise, just monitoring traffic generally through the tools, IDS and IPS tools that are out there goes a long way. Also want to make sure to incorporate the logs from medical devices and servers behind the scenes supporting those devices into audit log aggregation tools and security incident event management tools. So for those that are technically inclined, you'll know what I mean by those, the SIM tools, that get those such that you can do that advanced analytics and detection of malicious activity through log aggregation tools that can compare the medical device logs of what's happening on the domain control or other areas of the environment at the database level. And you can start to see those attacks in more real time and be able to react to them. And then if you do nothing else, I laugh about this USB one. Quick anecdote, we had a vendor that kept getting infected with this computer worm, really nasty computer virus, and it kept spreading to that device and then to the rest of the network. And every time we came back, and these same devices were getting infected, turns out the service person that to come in to service the devices was bringing an infected USB device. Every time he came, like every week literally, to service the device, he would plug his infected USB in and reinfect the system because it wasn't patched and it wasn't up to date. And so there's really not a whole lot of good reason to be using USB flash drive functionality for medical devices. If there is, it ought to be in an approved and controlled way. So look to implement restrictions for medical devices on USB devices. That actually goes a long way toward a lot of incidents that are happening out there. All right, I'll leave one last comment here. I want to leave some time for Lynn, who's going to walk us through some strategies around assessing, using kind of some tools to assess these platforms in your medical device program overall. But generally speaking, when you look at the medical device challenge and look to develop a program, it's got to address each element of the ecosystem. So there's activities that vendors need to be doing, medical device manufacturers. They need to be designing security in from day one, need to be providing patches and upgrades for legacy products, and continuing to assume that we're in the crosshairs of the attackers and look to put controls in place. For providers, it's the same story, but get that defense in depth mindset that it's not just about passwords, it's not just about patching, it's not just about education awareness. You've got to be doing all these things to really have a robust and layered program, and that should all be boiled up into your risk management and medical device security risk management program plan. If you don't have a plan, you don't have a structure around it, it's unlikely this stuff will get done in a meaningful way. Continue to work with the regulators and government agencies to drive incentives and disincentives for securing these things, and become an agent in that discussion wherever you sit on whatever side of the table. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Lynn, and really looking forward to hearing a little bit about some of the ways that you can track from an assessment perspective and do these, and then we'll open up for questions after that. So Lynn, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Brian. And for about the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce you to a Wolters Kluwer solution called Information Security Assessment Manager, or ISAM for short. And what we're doing with ISAM is we're providing organizations with a solution to assist you in assessing your IS risk across your enterprise, so being able to own that assessment process. And when you go through and you conduct assessments within ISAM, it gives you the ability to create and manage corrective action plans. It's going to allow you to work with an extensive amount of reporting within the system as well. And what we've done with ISAM is we've integrated into it the high trust framework and all of the standards that that framework encompasses. So things like HIPAA security, NIST, ISO, COBIT, PCI, Joint Commission, amongst others, while at the same time giving you the ability to supplement the content we're providing you with your own content, and being able to conduct these internal security risk assessments. All of the content in the system, and if I come into a sample control, all of the content within the system are closed-ended yes-no questions that you're going to be able to deploy to the appropriate individuals to answer. Respondents have the ability to include comments with their answers. They have the ability to attach supporting documentation with their answers. So having the evidence that you're doing the things that you're saying you're doing with these assessments tied right to it within the system. It's going to give you the ability to account for any threats that you're aware of in these different areas, vulnerabilities that you need to be able to manage. All of the content is tied back to the underlying regulatory material. So for the individuals that are answering the questions, providing them with a frame of reference so that they understand this is important. These standards speak to that, and being able to see that very clearly on the screen. There are risk ratings associated with all of the content that we have within the system, so you're going to be able to account for the likelihood of issues occurring. So likelihood is based on how the questions are being answered, the ability to identify an impact for your organization in these areas, and ultimately you will be assigned an overall risk score that you're then going to be able to report on, and based on that risk score determine if you need to create and need to be able to manage corrective action plans within the system. As far as that remediation piece goes, you're going to have the ability to determine for these areas that you've assessed, based on the risk, based on your own organizational views, are these areas that we need to remediate in? So if I come down to the bottom of the screen, I can decide, Are we going to accept the risk? Are we going to remediate? Maybe we want to remediate, but we need to defer it for the time being, that you're going to be able to make those choices and to create and manage the corrective action plans within our system. And then ultimately, and what might be the most important element of all of this, being able to generate an extensive amount of reporting on everything that you're doing within the system. And you have a lot of choice within ISAM as far as how you want to be able to present and work with the assessment results and all of the information that's generating as you're going through and conducting these assessments within the system. There are very detailed reports. There are higher level, more oversight type of reports that you can work with in ISAM. There are text and data reports, and as you can see with some of the reports I have up on the screen right now, alternate approaches to be able to present the information, charts and heat maps, color-coded scorecard reporting, recognizing that if and when you need to present this information to your board or to other stakeholders, that you can present the information in a way where at a glance they're going to be able to understand what you're assessing and where your risk exists through the reporting. So that is our IS assessment tool. And if it's something that you would like more information about or you would like a detailed demonstration of, we will be in touch with you with our sales representatives. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth and to Brian to see if there are any questions that we can take for the remainder of our time today.
And thank you, Lynn. We do have some questions. Folks, I must tell you that we lost some when the system went down. So if you had something that you felt was urgent to ask, please ask it again. If we don't get to it today, somebody will get back to you with the answers in the next couple of days. But here's your first question, Brian. What are some simple first steps in starting a medical device security program?
Sure, that's an easy one. Thanks, and welcome. I'll try to rattle through the questions quickly. I think first and foremost, if you haven't done an assessment to know where you stand, it's very difficult to build a program. Assessments can be quick, they can be targeted, they don't need to be super expensive, but they can give you a lay of the land so you can start building a meaningful program. What you don't want to do is spend a lot of energy and spin your wheels trying to focus on one area that you think is the most important or something where you know there's issues, but there may be elements of the program that can be very quickly and effectively addressed and reduce a lot of the risk that you have in place, as opposed to spending too much energy in one area. So I'd say get the assessments done, either a general, quick, high-level assessment, or something more detailed if you're further along the process with something like an ethical hacking or penetration technical testing. But assess first and then build from there.
Oh, I'm sorry. How can we start the process with working with our medical device vendors to increase our level of security?
Great question. Great question. So the interface with the device manufacturers, it needs to be a partnership, like any other business relationship. And so one thing to avoid doing is getting into this finger pointing and kind of battle with your vendors to get through this. And sometimes it can be hard. It's a relationship like anything else. You need to have some give and take for sure. But start with it as a partnership relationship, which means look at your top handful of vendors as a starting point. Understand who the human beings are behind the scenes that you need to work with. Get to know them, work through, communicate your expectations around what your requirements are from a security standpoint, what your security policies are, and understanding how devices and platforms can align with that or can align with that or cannot align with that, and figure out where those gaps are so that you can track and work through them together over time and beginning to get the dialogue going forward. And then, I mentioned earlier about, get the assessments done, get the questionnaires out there so you can understand at the right level of detail how they're aligning or not aligning. Get the contracts and SLAs in place so everybody's on the same page, get the procedures in place. And I think a lot of that helps drive the conversations going forward so it's clear who owns what, and you can have a more productive conversation rather than pointing at each other and saying, well, it's your job, no, it's your job, which doesn't work and which many organizations have tried. So if you're one of them, I can tell you it doesn't work. So again, just engage in a productive conversation and then go from there. Share, should be transparent about what you're seeing, your assessments, what you're trying to deal with, transparent about being open to how they can help or how you can help them. So that's how I'd recommend getting started with working with the vendors, and then it becomes an ongoing process from there.
Here's a great one. You may not have it handy at the moment, and that's part of the question, but they'd like to be able to point their medical device team to an FDA.gov webpage that states that the FDA expectation is that the medical devices are to be kept patched and updated. I think everyone's run into that challenge according to this question. Is that something you need to get back to them on, or can you answer it here?
Sure. I mean, with the link, I've got to get back to you. But if you look at the FDA's been working the road on the road, doing the road show for a couple of years now. So if you're not plugged into some of the industry consortium groups they have physical meetings where they get everybody together. They've done a bunch of those this year. They also have kind of the webinar version of that where everybody dials in. And the meeting minutes from that are available and accessible. We'll get some links out to the group after this where you can go to see them. But check those out, and you can see kind of the dialogue that the FDA's had and their perspective on this. They also have a couple frameworks that they put out an interim set of guidelines, and they revised it earlier this year, so we could look to those as well. And it's more in the dialogue that you hear from the FDA about the patching, what the expectations are. So we'll look to those meeting minutes and things. We'll get some links out to the group, and you know, you got to be careful because there's a lot of information and it's hard to digest and all, but it's in there. So we'll send those links and welcome any questions to point you in the right direction from there.
Great, thank you. How do we prioritize the devices that we should start with first?
Great question. They're all great questions. I guess I should assume that. In terms of prioritization, this is a tricky one. I think, you know, for organizations to tackle, I think you start with volume. You know, if you don't have an inventory together, look at procurement, look at the spend you have with your medical device vendors, or look at the volume of assets that you have from a GE or a Philips or whoever, and pick. I would start with the top two, just in terms of pure volume of what you have deployed out there. And try to get some semblance of that relationship and conversation going around the spectrum of devices that are deployed with that vendor. And then use that, either use one vendor or two vendors as a pilot to start to build your program, start to understand how you interface, what your control expectations are, what your policies are. And then once you have that defined, you have a plan defined, you have kind of a well-oiled process more or less with that vendor or vendors, then look to deploy that to the rest of the ecosystem and the rest of your environments out there. I think if you try to take it on all at once and you start having conversations with 100 vendors, it's going to choke on the bandwidth of being able to have a productive conversation and really dig as deep as you need to address the issues. So start small, pilot out, build your process, and then scale from there.
Our biomed engineering group resides outside of information technology. Do you have any suggestions on how the two groups might work together to better support and manage the security of clinical medical devices in use?
Definitely. So that's a common backdrop to this challenge is biomed historically has been outside of IT. A lot of times they're starting to report back into IT, so that's going to change. But either way, you need a relationship there, and we recommend a specific governance body, not that you want another committee and a meeting in your life, but at least a checkpoint where you get biomed, IT, compliance, and whoever else you think needs to be at the table to talk about, you know, here's our assessment, here's what we've done, here's where the issues are, here's what we need to do together to address that, and having that kind of, I'll call it kind of a dotted line relationship where you have a regular forum, you have some expectations on who does what, and you have a communication mechanism is most important as a starting point. It doesn't necessarily matter whether biomed reports to IT or not. You all have to come to the table and be willing to work on it together, and also getting leadership buy-in to establish such a committee, and understanding that framing the issue is important, so that you make sure that any work product coming out of those committees is put forward for funding and support, and gets that funding and support so you can actually move forward effectively. So, you know, that's standard governance 101, but I think certainly applies to the situation. And I wouldn't get us hung up on the reporting relationships. Just make sure that you have that body that can get everybody to the table and start working through it together.
Are vendors required to provide MDS2?
I don't think so. I think you can ask for it, and they certainly have standardized. MDS2 is that security survey that's sent to the manufacturers most manufacturers have completed an NDS squared, NDS2 form, so you can usually get it. I don't think there's a whole lot of pushback on that. It's a starting point, but it's not the only place you want to look. I don't believe it's required, to my knowledge. I think it's a standard that's been put out there and folks have adopted, but there's no there's no federal mandate or anything that I'm aware of that requires it.
We have some more, so we're going to have to get back to people individually, as you say, because now they're flowing in. I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. The slides are posted, and you'll be getting your CEU survey as we discussed. Brian, thank you. Nerve under pressure, very great webinar. We thank everyone for sticking by us today.
Thanks, everybody. My pleasure.